Hello everyone and welcome to this presentation, The Christmas Story in Greek and Latin from the Gospel according to Luke. My name is Christopher Ehlers. This is a multilingual, non-denominational linguistic approach to reading ancient Greek and Latin based on the Christmas story. It is intended to benefit anyone interested in learning these ancient languages, regardless of denomination or faith. The central premise of this comparative approach is that we can more effectively learn languages by viewing them as mere dialects of one another, as opposed to separate languages altogether. In this respect, this approach runs counter to conventional linguistic theory, which views Greek and Latin as separate languages because speakers of one would not necessarily understand speakers of the other. But for the student interested in practical learning, there is much to be gained through a comparative approach, particularly with the aid of a familiar writing such as the Christmas story. This approach is a linguistic approach and not a religious or theological one. I am not a theologian, but an environmental law professor and a practicing attorney with a specialty in air pollution law. However, I have a background in Romance languages and classical languages, which helps me with the mechanics of language and the techniques for language acquisition. I should note that some existing knowledge of ancient Greek and Latin would be helpful for following this presentation. However, even for those with no previous knowledge of these languages, this presentation is designed to show the relationships among these languages and English and encourage further study of them. I will dispense with a discussion of accents and pronunciation, which tend to discourage and frustrate first-time language learners. For pronunciation, I will adopt the general approach used in introductory textbooks, which is intended to help students learn grammar and not necessarily duplicate historical usage. I should note that even scholars differ on the preferred pronunciation of ancient languages. Finally, the Greek text in this presentation is taken from the 28th edition of the Nestle-Aland Greek New Testament. The Latin text is taken from the New Vulgate from the Vatican. So on we go to Luke chapter 2. The first verse of the second chapter of Luke tells us about the famous decree of Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus. In plain English, it reads something like this: "And it happened in those days that there came out from Caesar Augustus a decree that the entire world be registered." It starts out with a passive verb, "it happened." The Greek uses the third person singular aorist tense, that is, a past tense, egeneta, which is derived from the present verb ginomai, meaning I become. In contrast, the Latin uses the passive perfect form factum est, meaning there happened, which is derived from the present verb facio, meaning I make. A verb changes form depending on the identity of the person acting, that is, first person, second person, or third person, and depending on the number of persons acting, that is, singular or plural. We call the changing of a verb form a conjugation. The next words, de in Greek and autem in Latin, are words that tend to move along the discourse in each language without adding much substantive information. In Greek, de is an example of a particle. In Latin, autem is an example of a conjunction. They both may be translated simply as and in this context. Next, we have a prepositional phrase for in those days, which demonstrates the inflected nature of the languages. The Greek phrase en tais hemerais akenais literally reads, in the days those, while the Latin phrase in diebus illis literally reads, in days those. Greek has a definite article corresponding to the English word the, which takes the form of tais in this context. Latin does not have a definite article. Each language places the pronoun for those, that is, akenais in Greek and illis in Latin, after the noun. The feminine nominative forms for this pronoun are akene in Greek and illa in Latin. These are the demonstrative pronouns corresponding to the English pronouns that in the singular and those in the plural. Like a noun, the form of a demonstrative pronoun or adjective changes depending on the gender, number, and case of the modified noun. We call the changing of a noun, pronoun, or adjective form a declension. In this case, the noun being modified, days, is feminine and plural. The Greek nominative for day is hemera, a feminine form that gives us the English derivative ephemeral. The Latin nominative for day is dies, which gives us the English derivative diurnal. The Greek phrase is in the dative case, while the Latin phrase is in the ablative case. Note that the inflected words tend to end in the letter S, which is a common sign of a plural form in both languages. So what happened in those days? Well, an edict came out. In Greek, this was a dogma, a feminine nominative form. In Latin, this was an edictum, a neuter nominative form. These words give us the English cognates, dogma and edict. To express the idea that the edict came out, each language uses a derivative of the verb to go that contains the prefix ex to emphasize that something is coming out from someone or someplace. In Greek, exelthen is the verb that is used in this context. It is the third person singular aorist tense. That is another example of the past tense. It is derived from the present verb erchomai, meaning I go out. In Latin, exeat is the equivalent perfect tense form, derived from the present verb exeo, meaning I go out. The English prefix ex, meaning out of, and the English word exit are derived from these forms. So where is the edict coming out from? From Caesar Augustus. In Greek, this is expressed by a prepositional phrase introduced by the preposition para, meaning from, the phrase being para Caesaras Augustu. In Latin, this is also expressed by the use of a prepositional phrase, this time the preposition being a, meaning from, and the phrase being a Caesare Augusto. The structure of the prepositional phrase is similar in each language, although the Greek phrase is in the genitive case, while the Latin phrase is in the ablative case. This follows the convention for these particular prepositions. Finally, the verse tells us the purpose of the edict. The Greek uses a passive infinitive construction plus the noun being registered in the accusative case. The language is apographisthai pasan tein oikumenein, which means for the whole world to be registered. The feminine nominative for world, oikumene, is derived from the masculine nominative for the word oikos, meaning house. The English word economy is derived from these words. The adjective for whole is pasan, inflected from the feminine nominative form pasa. The Greek uses a passive infinitive to tie this all together, apographisthai, meaning to be registered. It is derived from the verb grapho, meaning I write, plus the prefix apa, meaning from. Together, apographo means I register or I record. In contrast, Latin uses a purpose clause in the passive subjunctive voice, plus the noun being registered in the nominative case. The entire clause in Latin is ut describeretur universus orbis, meaning so that the whole world may be described. In Latin, the word ut is used to introduce a purpose clause placed in the subjunctive voice. The word describeretur, a third-person singular imperfect subjunctive form, is derived from the present verb describo, meaning I describe, or literally I write about. This is one verb in a family of Latin verbs that derive from the present verb scribo, meaning I write. This family gives us a host of English words, such as inscribe, describe, and circumscribe. The notion of the entire world is reflected by the phrase universus orbis. The adjective universus, meaning whole or entire, gives us the noun universe in English. The noun orbis, meaning sphere, refers to the shape of the world, like an orb, and gives us the English words orb and orbit. The ancient Romans used the phrase orbis terrarum, literally meaning sphere of lands, to refer to the entire world. The form terrarum is a plural genitive form inflected from the nominative form terra, meaning land, which gives us our English words territory, terrestrial, and terrarium. In the second verse, Luke tells us that this first registration happened when Quirinius was governing Syria. The word for first in Greek, prote, gives us the English derivatives proton and prototype. Similarly, the word for first in Latin, prima, gives us the English derivatives prime and primary. The nouns for registration in both languages, apographe in Greek and descriptio in Latin, represent the result of the action described by the verbs. We see a new feature of grammar to refer to this registration, the feminine demonstrative pronoun haute in Greek and the feminine demonstrative pronoun haik in Latin. These demonstrative pronouns, which are equivalent, are different from the demonstrative pronouns in the first verse. In the first verse, akene in Greek and illa in Latin mean that in English. In the second verse, haute and haik mean this in English. Writers in the ancient languages would use one or the other pronoun depending on how close something was. But the use is not always consistent, as ancient writers would choose one or the other depending on the intended effect. Finally, we have another type of phrase to refer to the circumstances when this registration occurred. In Greek, we have hegemoneiontos tes Syrias Quiriniu, which we can translate as with Quirinius governing Syria. Here, the Greek places a noun and a participle in the genitive case. A participle is a verbal noun derived from a verb which is declined like a noun rather than conjugated like a verb. The participle is hegemoneiontos, derived from the Greek verb hegemoneo, meaning I govern. It can be translated by the word governing in this context. The noun is Quiriniu, the genitive of Quirinios, the name of a man. In this example, the word for Syria is also placed in the genitive case, that is, tes Syrias, not because of this rule of grammar, but because the Greek verb meaning I govern, hegemoneo, requires its object, that is, the land being governed, or Syria, to be placed in the genitive case. Note that the definite article follows the word for Syria in the genitive case. In Latin, the structure is slightly different. We place the noun praesidus, meaning president, and the proper noun Quirinius in the ablative case. Therefore, we have praeside Syriae Quirino, which we can translate as with Quirinius as president of Syria. In Latin, Syria is also placed in the genitive case, Syriae, even though the other words are in the ablative case. In Latin, a noun that modifies another noun is typically placed in the genitive case. This concludes the first two verses of Luke chapter 2. I will pick up on the next verse in the next video.